I already made a video talking about the beauty of multiplayer games, so of course, gotta make one on single player games, and the upsides of such a format, but also some of the things that people tend to take issue with when it comes to a single player title, even if I disagree to the prefer single player titles, especially in this day and age where you get paid in order to use multiplayer. No, I'm not letting that go. Single player games, compared to its multiplayer counterpart through its more social interaction, here you got experiences that try to have more of an immersive experience and try to pretty much tie down its gameplay, get things more focused and designed. Also multiplayer where some things end up lacking, whether it be because, hey, you have more players to work together with, so some mechanics end up getting distributed amongst each other and everything, or the fact that single player has a more set end goal when it comes to what it's going for. I remember when I worked for GameStop for a bit, where someone told me how they felt that the advent of online multiplayer to them meant that single player games shouldn't exist anymore. You're focusing on the part where I said with that GameStop for a bit, aren't you? Because they didn't understand what the point of single player game would be in a world where multiplayer games became more and more of a norm. Mind you, they were talking in the context when it came to Call of Duty Black Ops 4, which I believe removed the single player campaign in favor of going all in for a multiplayer experience, which didn't really rub people the right way, since people love single player experience because of Call of Duty, but it does understand that a lot more people do enjoy the more multiplayer aspect of Call of Duty. One genre in particular that people really advocate works best in a single player setting is horror games. The idea of just the single player themselves and the game trying to create this experience of trying to horrify the player in various ways. I remember for years, especially 2010s, people kept feeling like a multiplayer setting would dull the horror because having more people with you would in fact make the horror less scary. To which I say, we've had many multiplayer horror games nowadays that prove that point wrong, but you get the idea that you want to be immersed in an experience, especially with horror, that requires a lot of immersion. You don't want anything else to get in the way of it. So it does make sense why people would say that the horror franchise or horror genre works with that. One example being Resident Evil, which for the longest time, the mainline games were single player horror games, and then RE5 is where people started taking issue with it, and although many did love being able to bring a friend into this action horror franchise, many preferred it if it was just the player and this more immersive experience, which then we got Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, which fulfilled that wish people had, and now Resident Evil 9 Requiem seems to be trying to fulfill that as well. So one of the things where a horror genre specifically, ideally for a lot of people, would be in a single player experience. For me personally, action games, I feel, thrive way more when it comes to single player games because developers get to flesh out the mechanics more in order to have this one-time gameplay experience for a single player setting. For me, my gripe is that when you try to take a thing like an action game or anything else into a multiplayer setting, they want each player to be as powerful as can be, so they generally try to assign roles and spread out the abilities. Remember something like a first-person shooter, like for example, when I reviewed The Darkness, I mentioned how multiplayer mode took the powers from single player that Jackie had and then distributed it amongst the multiplayer characters, which kind of made it more of a duller experience because each player had a fraction of the abilities. It also meant they didn't have anyone to play with, that meant you're just a more nerfed version of Jackie as a result. Despite RPGs from their inception being a multiplayer focused thing with tabletop RPGs, we do live now in an age where people associate RPGs more with single player experiences, trying to tell a major narrative for a lot of people to focus on the narrative aspect, so that's what they care about most. Can an RPG pretty much entwine them in this whole entire world they're going for and the story being told, and so many people feel it should be more of a single player experience as a result, even if from the inception RPGs were more gameplay focused and more of a social thing than anything else. than compared to modern day RPGs where they just think of a video game that's trying to tell a story and everything. I mentioned Resident Evil as a single player franchise that got multiplayer focused entries, but the Tales of franchise generally had multiplayer in them. Granted, they were never a big focus, but they were a thing that people enjoyed playing those games for, to play the games with their friends or relatives, and so they got upset when Tales of Arise removed the multiplayer aspect, making it a fully single-player RPG. And you would think with that would mean, oh, that means they can spruce up and pretty much highlight the single-player combat more, so to worry about multiplayer aspects. And they'll look at the camera and tell you, no, in fact, Tales of Arise actually aggressive in places, despite the fact they don't account for the multiplayer aspect because of the gameplay. But if you're on PC, you can play Tales of Arise multiplayer with mods, so there is that aspect if you wish to, but the game is designed solely to be a single player RPG, and despite the new specific focus, it doesn't reflect the game rate takes full advantage of it. You also have the video game genre of immersive sim, with stuff like Deus Ex Human Revolution and Mankind Divided, which I have not found an immersive sim that's actually multiplayer. I see some say only like 1 or 2 exist, period. Some of which exist, but, or more, existed at one point and no longer exist. But it's a genre that feels like can really be done in a multiplayer setting. It has to be a single player because of all the upgrades and different paths and choices the player has in those kind of games. That it's the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, it has to work single player only. It can be multiplayer. I do want to mention that there are many games or genres that people do wish could be played multiplayer, since people like the idea of playing with their friends, but some things that just wouldn't really work, or like I said, could something like the Darkness 2, we have to spread out the abilities amongst the players, and thus the enjoyment becomes cooperatively, but also means the individual player now has less they can do. Just like how there are single player games that have shorter multiplayer modes, there are also multiplayer games that feel the single player is shoehorned in, such as the fighting game genre, where many feel like a single player mode of sorts is always shoehorned in, since fighting games from their very inception are a multiplayer focused genre. Trying to add a single player mode can be a crapshoot, with a lot of times people generally bashing the idea of how could it ever work, or if they do, it generally leaves a lot to be desired in how they function. Why people praise like Mortal Kombat 9, where, oh, this game has a single player story. Granted, people put up in hindsight, a single player aspect was not that great for story mode, and the chapter system kind of shoots its ideas in the foot, but people did enjoy it. Or Blazblue, which has an entire large single player campaign and everything, but when it comes to Blazblue, most focus on the multiplayer aspect because, yeah, it's a fighting game. You should focus on the multiplayer aspect, but that does not erase how much effort developers put into the player aspect of it. Or even some games like the Borderlands franchise, in which, yeah, you can play Borderlands single player and fully do an entire campaign. I cannot stand the idea of playing Borderlands single player because it just becomes mind-numbing to a certain degree, because of the fact that from the very inception, each character, each player has a role. So trying to play the game single player feels like I'm just handicapping myself to some degree, on top of the fact that the social aspect is what makes the Borderlands games for me, and leaving me stuck in a room with Borderlands level writing will probably make me go insane at some point. So for me, I cannot handle Borderlands single player because I feel like it's clearly designed for multiplayer, so I can get to a single player setting. I feel like it doesn't really work well. I see many other people also mention how they only play Borderlands in a multiplayer setting and not single player. You also have many multiplayer only games that are designed for that purpose, so you can't really add a single player mode in there. This is why people for some reason trying to say there should be, or the aspect where people instead will call those multiplayer only games quote unquote friend slop, and it's like, no, it's not a multiplayer only game, so Quinn can add single player focus because it just wouldn't work. Something like Friday the 13th game actually did try to add a single player mode, making it more challenge based and how the multiplayer aspect is, with chasing down the survivors, but it actually just tried to do something different, which for some people worked, some people didn't really like it much, but they did make the attempt of adding in a single player mode, so the attempt is should be lauded that they did try. Beat 'em ups are also another example where, generally, with the nature of beat 'em ups, you generally want to have more people with you, since the ideal experience of a beat 'em up is arcade multiplayer fun, getting you some buds together and just having fun with those games. But like I said, you can play them solo, and for ones I played, they're entertaining solo. Just more the fact of you can feel that at a certain extent, especially if a game goes on for longer than it should be, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. That's a fun beat 'em up. It starts going on longer than it needs to be, so you can realize the social aspect of what's really needed to keep the enjoyment going, as opposed to something like single player, where at some point your mind's gonna start going numb. So one of those things where you can see why beat 'em ups generally want you to have more people around, not just for the gameplay aspect of making cool combos, getting enemies stuck in your attacks and beat 'em up style, stuff like that. It's also the fact of, because the main focus, if it starts going on for longer and longer, you may feel like there's not much for you if you're playing alone, but with friends, you're gonna have a blast. I can't remember how the public learned about this. Not sure it was a officially released trailer or anything, or was it just a leak, but there was a Spider-Man multiplayer game in the works that got cancelled, and we're seeing many people wish the game actually got made. It was a multiplayer Spider-Man game. I, however, am glad it got cancelled, because I feel like the novelty of the game would fall apart soon, it's not much long afterwards, on top of the fact of how would you really realistically make a multiplayer Spider-Man game keep working and working unless you make a live service game, and I already don't like live service games, so I'd rather the developers, Insomniac, not be stuck to a live service game, and instead be able to just make more games and enjoy single-player Spider-Man games. Like, I get it, people want to play them for the whole multiplayer thing. I think a multiplayer mode could work, like Batman Arkham Origins have a multiplayer mode, but trying to make a whole game of open world multiplayer Spider-Man, that idea, in specifically this day and age, if I were a kid, I'd probably be like, that's cool, but nowadays, with how companies treat multiplayer games and live service, that feels like it's going to be an awful idea. It's like how Naughty Dog with The Last of Us, they wanted to do the multiplayer mode factions, but Sony wanted a live service game, and they want to dedicate their entire studio just to make one live service game. So instead they did what they were more experts at, which were some more single player games, and they're making a new one, and it's a new IP. So you can see a whole entire thing where they didn't want to be pigeonholed to the downsides of trying to make a multiplayer big focus thing of, gotta be a live service because the publisher wants all the money from you. In a more unique case, the From Software games, whether it be Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, etc., do have a big multiplayer emphasis, especially Demon's Souls, where they immediately from the get-go show you, hey, get some people to help you if you're stuck and everything, but people vehemently try to only treat them as a single-player RPG and just don't want help because they want the single-player reward and feeling and sensation overcoming a difficult challenge, even if the game gives them the option of calling for assistance and everything. I don't think people are so stubborn about it. But once again, you can do that, and that's good for them. But it's one of those things where the games are more multiplayer, I want to say focused, because, like I said, they want you to call in for help, and then made Elden Ring Night Rain an entire multiplayer-focused game that can be played solo, but people already play stuff like From Software games solo and just don't call for assistance by it being a big mechanic of the game. The Left 4 Dead franchise as well, where those games, yeah, you can put them solo with AI. Once again, they were designed for you to get 3 buddies together and have fun shooting zombies and everything. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you can, like I said with Borderlands, you can play it solo, but again, I feel like it'd probably be a worse experience if you did play it solo, because some games, the single player there is an option, and it is appreciated, it's an option, but you can tell what developers were really going for. You also have certain properties that people don't associate with a single player setting. For example, despite there being many games for Dragon Ball that are single player focused, A lot of people will generally associate Dragon Ball with a multiplayer aspect because, oh, people think Dragon Ball, they think of Dragon Ball Z. When they say Dragon Ball Z, they think of fighting. So they think, oh, fighting game. And then instead, hey, here's Dragon Ball Z Kakarot RPG. Remember Super Nintendo? Here are some card-based RPGs. The DS. Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans. Yes, I know in America it's called Kai, but Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans, what do you want from me? And like many aspects like that where it's like, hey, here are more RPG outings, or generally anime shows in general people associate with more multiplayer focus. Remember when Fairy Tail got a game, it's like, oh, here's a Fairy Tail RPG, and people were like, whoa, a Fairy Tail RPG is typically, that's freaking cool kind of thing, because people associate with freaking battle shonen franchises with fighting and fighting game. So when they get something that's not that, they're like, oh, that's cool, single player experience is dead. That's unique. So it's like one of those things where there are certain properties that people generally associate with, oh, this will be a multiplayer game, and it's not. And it can either be a fun surprise, or it could generally just make them mad it was a multiplayer game, because once again, we associate the IP or property with. Speaking of anime property, you also have Sailor Moon back on the Super Famicom, got Sailor Moon Another Story, which was a single player RPG. Granted, on the platform you also had fighting games and beat 'em ups, but for them, Another Story tends to be the one I see people mention as like the cult classic one that not a lot of people know about, but it's one that people generally enjoy and wish they did more Sailor Moon RPGs, more Sailor Moon single-player experiences like that, as opposed to like Dragon Ball where people want more multiplayer focus, more fighting game stuff. Speaking of anime properties, I mentioned how Dragon Ball tends to get a lot of fighting games, but it reminded me that One Piece is actually in an opposite situation where there's very few actual dedicated fighting games for One Piece, and instead One Piece mostly gets RPGs throughout the years. I was reminded about how even the 3DS got the, what thing was called a One Piece Romance Dawn, but mostly One Piece gets like action RPGs or turn-based RPGs for the most part. It's like an opposite effect. I know that one of the games on Wii, called Unlimited Adventure, did have a battle mode where the characters could play as. Once again, that's kind of the opposite thing, where One Piece usually has single-player titles when it comes to that. I know nowadays One Piece is mostly known for the Pirate Warrior series, but for the most part, One Piece had RPGs instead, which is one of those fascinating things. They go for RPGs to be action turn-based, as opposed to something like Dragon Ball, like a Yu Yu Hakusho, which just got a lot of freaking fighting games. Although Yu Yu Hakusho did get the action top-down game on Game Boy Advance, and also a tactical RPG on Game Boy Advance as well. It's kind of one of those interesting thoughts on handle properties. Although now I must say, does anyone else find it weird how, despite we have the freaking Gundam Dynasty Warriors game, got the Pirate Warriors games and everything, that no one ever thought to make a freaking Dragon Ball freaking Warriors game? It's one of those things you think, how it kind of Dragon Ball, what things you can do. Like, the Pirate Warriors games are freaking great, and I've certainly heard people really like the Dynasty Warriors Gundam that never got to play, but only came out in the PS3 era. It's one of those things that Dragon Ball never got one. Especially since Pirate Warriors games even make sure to include the pre-time skip characters as the freaking Pirate Warriors games kept going on. It's now turned to a ramble about Warriors games, so it's one of those things that I feel weird that Dragon Ball never actually got one, you know? One of those weird aspects. But yeah, One Piece generally is associated with RPGs. One anime property on Medcheck, also player games generally, is also Tokyo Ghoul, mostly with Tokyo Ghoul Jail, that never left Japan and it's mostly a visual novel game. But also the big one that did get a worldwide release, Tokyo Ghoul Re Call to Exist, which is you ever want to play a basic action game that abridges the anime, which is already in abridging of the manga, and the anime is also unfaithful to the manga, so that's double pain. So what have you been playing this game for? But hey, it got released internationally if people want to check it out. Before I've heard, the only real worthwhile thing is the multiplayer that you'll probably not really get anymore nowadays, because people probably already played Tokyo Ghoul Recall to Exist. So, there's that. Tokyo Ghoul technically got priority when it comes to single player games. There's the fact that, much like the anime, Tokyo Ghoul got done dirty. It's up that the best thing you can get for Tokyo Ghoul content in a video game is Dead by Daylight. You also have single player games that do try and include some sort of social aspect to them. Like one game I'm talking about is Xenoblade Chronicles 2 with the core crystal mechanic. And this mechanic essentially allows you to summon a blade randomly. It works via a gacha system, which turned off a lot of people, including me. But the reason it's in it is because it allows you to share the results you got with other players. Maybe you got a really cool common blade. Maybe you got a rare blade. I'm able to do the character side quest, and this rare blade is designed by a guest artist or stuff like that. Maybe you got the rarest blade in the game, and I get to brag to your friends how you got this, and they don't. It allowed them to spread the game more and have this fun social aspect despite being a single player RPG. Granted, ever since freaking Muskie Boy took over Twitter and console companies don't want to have Twitter on the console, it means that this Twitter aspect kind of got essentially gutted in a sense, because less people are going to go to the effort of having their images and stuff taken from the Switch, either moved to their phone or moved to their PC, as opposed to used to be just immediately posted via the app on the console itself. So thanks to that party aspect of core crystals got gutted, but you can see what the idea was when it was in its heyday and worked ideally as developers wanted. That's also a big thing for choice-based games like the Mass Effect franchise, where there are so many different choices, whether it be small or big, that carry over between the three main games, and you can see what other people did and share your results with your friends, see what they did, how come they got, or be inspired that, oh, that happened in your run? Let me do another run of the game, and now I'll get to have that results. Or maybe you found some trick that they didn't know about, some really elusive results require certain circumstances to fulfill. And that one big aspect comes from freaking choice-based games. The fact that you get to have this social aspect, even though it's not a multiplayer game in itself. Just ignore Mass Effect 3 did add a multiplayer mode, but shut the f*** up, I'm trying to make a point here. So the whole entire thing where you can freaking see how, hey, we add a social aspect, spreads the word of the game, spreads the popularity, and stuff like that to a single player game. So that's when I ramble when it comes to single player games, and the aspects that make single player games so interesting, and what kind of experience developers go for. Like I said, I understand why people can see a cool single player game and want to be multiplayer. Like, people think, oh, they should make classic Resident Evil, but multiplayer. And they did. Resident Evil Outbreak, they didn't bring it back. I mean, they couldn't remember it, Resident Evil Requiem, but chance it could come back and be just the whole entire thing. But it's one of those things where not everything, just because it'd be a cool idea, because of, oh, this is a fun game, will it be more fun with more people? Sometimes it won't, especially with how games have to be balanced around not as more people and everything. So it's going to whole entire issue. Or some games that are clearly designed for multiplayer focus, so trying to then add in a single player mode as a bonus option ends up making it feel tacked on. And I know that many people do focus on multiplayer modes that are tacked on, but it could be single player modes as well that are also just tacked on and aren't all that enjoyable because they're not what the game developers are really going for. What I'm talking about? Alright then, go out there, play some single player games, whatever kind of genre, or maybe just one of those people who enjoy playing Borderlands solo. I don't, but I know many people do in fact enjoy that because Borderlands is Borderlands, and Borderlands is awesome. Alrighty then, good day.